Okay, thanks, Mark and Bridget. Great to have you here. And if you can kind of follow Joshua's example and talk to us about elements that you think are important and what kind of questions. Thanks.
So my name is Mark Pascall. I'm the Executive Director of BlockchainNZ. So we're a membership group representing the crypto blockchain community in New Zealand, part of NZ Tech. My personal background, all my career in software development in the last 5 years in blockchain software development, co-founded a company called Blockchain Labs, run 2 international blockchain conferences and spoken at about 30, 40 conferences around the world on this topic. What I'd like to do is to try and demystify it a little bit further, as we see one of the key barriers to moving forwards at the sort of policy or the sort of corporate level is this understanding of the basic concepts by sort of non-technical people. Now I do have some slides. Are they going to be here? Okay, cool. Yep. So first slide, if it's there. So really, what's the big deal? We've got this Bitcoin crypto blockchain thing that just doesn't seem to go away. Everybody's got an opinion. We've heard the headlines around the volatility, the use in the dark web, the hacks. We've got some very smart people telling us it's the future. Go to the next slide. But we've also got some equally smart people telling us it's a huge nerdy Ponzi scheme. If we can go to the next slide. So it's a very confusing space to people not working in this space. You know, next slide. Yeah, the slide. In order to understand the blockchain world, we really need to understand about decentralization. This book came out about 20 years ago, the seminal book, and proposed the idea that the structure of society is based on the logic of violence. So we have this predator-prey relationship between makers of things and takers of things, and it's harder historically to protect your stuff than to make it. So in a hunter-gatherer society, we have a very flat, decentralized society because we can carry our belongings around with us. As society evolved, got more complex, we had houses, villages, we needed bigger and bigger entities to protect those things, armies, banks, nation states. And the internet turned up 20 years ago and rapidly accelerated that move from a decentralized society to a highly centralized society where we've got massive global scale disintermediation and centralization. So we essentially have a bunch of monopolies which are increasing wealth disparity and ultimately depleting the planet. Go to the next slide. So one search engine, one taxi company, one source of news, one shop, one accommodation provider. It's a slightly scary place we're moving towards. So I'd just like to sort of explain a little bit how it works, and don't take offense from this slide.
That's right.
What are you saying, with dummies?
But we do find it's really helpful to sort of really bring it back to basics. So go to the next slide. I have an apple. I live on a street with you. I don't trust you. You perhaps have a funny haircut, come home late at night, but I want to give you my apple. So I walk up to you and I hand my apple over to you. Now, imagine I am an artist, a digital artist. I create digital apples. I draw them in Photoshop on my computer, and I want to give you my digital apple. So I might create that in Photoshop. I might email it to you. But who owns that digital apple? I might have created 6 of those. I might have copied it 6 times, sent it to 6 of my friends. You might have done the same thing. When it's trivial to copy a digital asset, how do we know who owns it? So this is known as the double spending problem, and since the arrival of computers, some of the smartest guys in the world have been trying to solve this fundamental problem. And basically they couldn't. So the workaround is Harold. We can go to the next slide. Harold is a salt of the earth kind of a guy. I've known him for years, you've known him for years, we both trust Harold. So instead of me, so what I do is with my digital apple, I email it to Harold, and we ask Harold to keep a ledger, a list of who owns digital apples on our street. It could be a spreadsheet. He just adds that into the spreadsheet. So when I want to give you my digital apple, I email it to Harold. I say, can you put an entry in your ledger and forward it onto you? And so we now know who owns digital apples on the streets and on our street. And other people on our street may also trade digital apples as well. Problem solved. But there's a big but here. We need to trust Harold. Okay, we need to trust Harold that he's going to do a good job. He's going to lock his house at night. He's not going to come back drunk and lose the spreadsheet. He's not going to sell the information to Bob in the next street. And he's not going to also suddenly wake up one morning and realize he's got a bit of a monopoly on this digital Apple data and start charging more money for it. So we need to trust to Harold. So essentially our entire global commerce system has been built on this workaround, on the fact that we couldn't work out a way to transfer digital assets between us. So we used a trusted third party. So Harold, sort that for your banks, Uber, your government, our entire global system is based on that concept. The next slide. An interesting thing happened 10 years ago, a few months back, 10 years ago, sort of early on this year. Somebody under the pseudonym of Satoshi Nakamoto released a white paper. He brought together some concepts, some existing technologies, some cryptography principles, and gamifications, brought it together in a really clever way and essentially solved the double spending problem. He found a really clever way to allow us to transfer this digital asset from one person to another without a trusted intermediary, without Harold. And this architecture we now know as the blockchain, and Bitcoin was the first implementation of the blockchain. And since then, so Satoshi not only released the theory, as in this white paper, but he also released some source code, which he pushed out to the community in the form of this thing called Bitcoin, as this sort of idea of digital money. So I could transfer this made-up token from me to you without a trusted intermediary. So next slide. So how does it work? Again, it's not important to us to understand the plumbing and the maths, but there's some core concepts that we do need to understand. In many ways, the Bitcoin blockchain is similar to Harold's ledger. So it's just a list of transactions and it's a very long list. At the bottom, it's like a spreadsheet. At the bottom of the spreadsheet is the first transaction that happened 10 years ago from Satoshi. At the top of that ledger might be a transaction I might be between me and you today if I give you a Bitcoin. So if I've got a copy of that ledger, I know the complete state of the system. I know exactly who owns what Bitcoin in the world today. But the big difference between Harold's ledger, or your bank's ledger, which is on the center, on the left-hand side of the diagram, a server-based centralized system, on the blockchain, it's a decentralized system. So essentially what that means is there's lots of copies of that spreadsheet, lots of copies of Harold's spreadsheet, all on those different machines. On that diagram, we've got 6 machines, but in the Bitcoin network, we've got 20 or 30,000 machines all around the world, and anybody can join in that community. You can go home, install the software tonight, and you can become one of those nodes. We don't need to trust you. And the whole system is designed to continuously sync up. So if I do a transaction with you, it flows into one of those computers and then propagates out to the rest in a matter of minutes. So there's 2 really fundamental properties of that decentralized architecture. One is that there's no central control, so nobody in the middle, no bank, no central entity. It's community driven by anybody in the system. And the other key thing is that the data, once data flows in, essentially becomes immutable, unstoppable. So if you think about it, to take down that database, we need to delete all the database from all the machines, 30,000 computers at the same time. It would essentially be like taking down the internet. The other thing is if I want to hack into it to give myself some Bitcoin, I'd have to hack into 51% of those computers at the same time. So essentially impossible. So there's a really fundamental properties that we've never had before. Satoshi also introduced scarcity. So he put in the maths, it says we know only a certain number of Bitcoins are being released in the system every week, every month, and only 21 million can ever be produced. So if you've got scarcity, you've got demand, then you have value. And Bitcoin is currently trading at 13,000 NZ dollars per Bitcoin. So when I give you Bitcoin, I'm not giving you anything. We're both just agreeing to update this ledger, this source of truth, this spreadsheet that we both believe holds the source of truth. And the next slide. So cryptocurrency is a currency that is controlled by international community-driven laws of transparent open mathematics and not by the laws of people in government. And this is quite important because governments often use currency to control and manage us. So next slide. And it's really interesting to see where Bitcoin is now. It actually hasn't turned out to be a great medium of exchange, partly because of its volatility and partly because the transaction fees are quite high. But it has turned out to be more of a store of value, so kind of a digital gold. And this is what it's resulted in is huge speculation on the price, and which has driven it. And when you've got the sort of frictionless sort of system, demand, the price goes up, and demand goes down, and the price goes down. And so let's go to the next slide. And so this has created these bubbles, but we've now actually got some history to look back at the Bitcoin story. This is out of a book I got co-authored by a Kiwi guy who's on our committee. So we look at the first Bitcoin bubble in 2013, and just after that, it peaked. All the headlines were coming out. Oh, this is a Ponzi scheme. It's going to crash. Bitcoin's gone. So we go to the next slide. Next bubble, 2014, same thing, all the headlines, Bitcoin's dying. We go to the next slide. Which is where we're at now. And we look at the first bubble, it's nothing. So we've got this sort of concept of a scale invariance where we're coming out, and we've actually got a bit of history to look by. Go to the next slide. So soon after Bitcoin turned up, people realized that this immutable, unstoppable database could be used for a whole lot of other things other than a kind of digital cash or store of value. We could start it to track digital assets like a digital song, an in-game spaceship, a digital key to my house. In fact, go to the next slide, we could use it to store anything that has value to humanity, real world stuff like a vote, a qualification, a title deed, a supply and a hop in a supply chain across international boundaries, environmental data, a marriage certificate, that sort of thing. So it really opened up our eyes to what it could be done. The next slide. The next chapter in the whole Bitcoin or the whole blockchain story is something called Ethereum. So Bitcoin was designed as an experiment, very narrow focus as a digital cash or digital gold. So I can transfer value from me to you, but imagine if I wanted to transfer some value from me to you, but I wanted to build some business rules around that. I could only do it if two other people authorized it, and it's between the hours of 8 and 9 at night. I want to build complex business rules. So Bitcoin really wasn't designed to do that. So a young guy called Vitalik Buterin, who we brought over a couple of years ago, decided to build a new blockchain that from the ground up not only gave us sort of this ledger, this distributed ledger, but also this global code execution engine. So we could embed business logic code into the system. And once you put your business rules on the system, it becomes immutable, unstoppable. And that's what we now know as a smart contract, self-executing bunch of business rules code that once a developer puts them on, even the developer who put them on can't change them. And it has, again, huge implications because it changes the trust relationship. If I can use an example, a trivial example of gambling. If I wanted to create a gambling website today using sort of traditional technologies, I'd build a website, I'd allow you to roll a virtual dice, and you could win or lose money from going to my website. Now, you probably wouldn't use my website because you wouldn't trust me. You'd be going, I don't know this guy. I can't see what the odds are behind the scenes. This guy's going to rip me off. So you wouldn't use that website. But if I could build a gambling website using smart contracts, transparent, provable, immutable business rules, where when you threw the virtual dice, even the developer couldn't change it, and you could see what was going on, then you probably would use that system because you would need to trust me. You would trust the protocol, the infrastructure. And that's exactly what's happening with gambling. Actually, it's been one of the early use cases. Yeah, provably fair gambling websites are being very popular. So, but if you take that concept of not needing to trust the intermediary, you can apply it to many, many systems, our banking systems, our insurance systems, Facebook, Uber, the whole lot. So we've got a fundamentally new way of doing things. Go to the next slide. So we've entered a world where trust is moving towards distributed networks of machines that no one person, group, corporation, or government owns. Those networks have rock solid data integrity, zero downtime, and financial incentives for anybody who participates. Go to the next slide. So a really important part of the blockchain discussion is the concept of a token. So what infrastructures like Ethereum did was allowed us anybody to very easily create their own cryptocurrency, create their own coin. So I can cut and paste some code and create Mark coin tomorrow. But it wouldn't be very useful, it wouldn't be very valuable, nobody would use it. But imagine if we saw these cryptocurrencies not so much as a digital cash, but instead more like a digital asset where that asset within its code has clever things like incentive structures or scarcity or whatever I want to build into that code, so that a digital asset actually has intrinsic value. And we call this concept a token, and that's a generic name. But there's a big problem with token, which the governments, the regulators are wrestling with all over the world, is that token simply doesn't fit into the current system. So we go to the next slide. So a token can actually have 6 different faces. We can think of a token as a currency, analogous to the dollar or the yen, an equity, more like a stocks and shares. And we have sophisticated securities laws for things that are securities. It can be in a financial instrument, a derivative, bond, future. It can be more like a reward, like an airpoint dollar. It can be a right, more like a government-issued identity card or a share proxy that allows me to vote on something. And it can also be this kind of digital, this new concept, which the blockchain enables, of this digital asset, this what we call non-fungible token that has no physical equivalent. It just lives on the blockchain, but we can now prove ownership and we can transfer ownership of that thing. So the current problem is that the regulators, the lawmakers, the tax authorities have lots of rules for these things individually, but when we have this thing that can take many different faces, some, all of those, and they can even morph from one thing to another through its history, then the system starts to not work very well. And it's something that sort of the regulators are struggling all over the world. Next slide. First, last thing I want to mention is the concept of a DAO. So a DAO is what we call a decentralized autonomous organization. So we've talked about smart contracts, that these rules that we can use to build dApps, decentralized applications, like a DApp to disrupt Uber or a DApp to disrupt an insurance system. But now we can also start to build entire organizations that live on the blockchain, that have the rules as transparent, immutable rules that control them. And these are emerging. And just go to the next, just go click forward to the next, stop there. So these software layers that sit on top of the blockchain infrastructure, and they can have reputation systems, they can have value distribution, voting, governance, and ultimately these entities can have sort of purpose and allow groups of people to achieve something, just like an organization, and they're living more and more and they're living more and more fully on chain. Some of these literally have no connection to the real world. Kind of this ultimate sort of regulatory arbitrage, and they're moving quite quickly and starting to amass value and a lot of people behind them. So these are happening. So that's the next one. Oh yeah, so just have a quick look around at what the other governments are doing. So these are just some of the headlines. So Zug in Switzerland, they were sort of one of the earliest sort of champions of all things blockchain. Next slide. Estonia, again, they've done some interesting stuff. Next one. Malta, so that they've, again, a lot of the smaller countries have just created sort of, quite interesting rules around what you can and can't do, and captured market share. A bunch of states in the US are doing stuff. Colorado, next one. Arizona, next one. And in the US is currently being debated. It's something called the Token Taxonomy Act, which is really interesting take on this. Again, sort of trying to address this fundamental problem of we've got this new thing. What can we do? We need to change the laws. Next one. Dubai want to become the first ever blockchain-powered government. Next one. And France, the Minister of Finance is saying we want to make blockchain a priority. So other countries are already taking this quite seriously. You go forwards. Next slide. So in New Zealand, we've had three reports written, one by the Law Commission, one by the EHF, Edmund Hillary Fellowship, and my most recent one that Josh Orchard, the Callaghan Centrality funded one. So they've all made a bunch of recommendations. I'm just go to the next slide. So to summarize Josh's report, eight core recommendations, which I won't go into, but as an association, we support all of those. But again, this world is moving very, very quickly. Even that report is starting to become a little bit out of date. And next slide. So I think as an association, we believe that blockchain has the potential to offer many benefits to the New Zealand economy, and the opportunity for New Zealand to take some leadership in globally and using blockchain for positive global impact. We as a country, just to sort of echo some of what Josh said, we can leverage our advantages such as our small international brand of trust and integrity, our small size and ability for our lawmakers, regulators, and entrepreneurs to work closely together, and our lifestyle in attracting some of the key people to this beautiful place. We'd love the government and New Zealand corporations to see blockchain as this completely neutral public digital infrastructure, just like the internet or email. For policy to serve the public good, governments need to actively co-lead policy frameworks with the private sector and focus on actively shaping the market outcomes together. We would argue that a passive attitude will mean that we fall further behind other countries globally. We believe this is vital that government takes a holistic approach to this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, potentially in the form of ministerial responsibility and or cross-agency working group. Do our governments and regulators want to be architects of the future or victims of it? Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Mark. Look, we've got probably just a few minutes. So, somebody, you had a question? Yeah, Lawrence? Anybody else? There you go.
Cool. Hey, thank you.
Hi, Tony.
Talk to me. One of the recommendations talks about financial crime prevention forum. Can you just talk through some of, and I guess that signals just a bigger concern that I have just around crime and what that looks like and some of the bigger risks. What are your biggest risk concerns?
Around using blockchain technology. I think the obvious one is we have a closed, controlled system where the governments and the banks can get access to information or financial information when they want, and the courts can enforce that. We are moving, whether we like it or not, to a world where there are other ways to transfer value, and I think the genie's out. We can't stop that. So that does open up risks of money laundering and a whole world living outside the system that we have more control over. So we need to accept that, and we need to look at other ways to control and to achieve the outcomes we want. And there's no easy answer to this, but we need to have people who really get. We need to increase, I think, the amount of money we're throwing at the people who are policing this, and we need to. And work together more with our sort of colleagues internationally to deal with some of the problems that are emerging, but they're there. We can't sort of put our head in the sand.
And so you, and that's part of the reason that we're talking today. You think the government has a role to be able to regulate that, yeah?
Regulate, I think, yeah. We don't know. I think there's. What the government does, whether it creates more regulation, less regulation, is a conversation that needs to be had and explored. We don't have the answers, and whatever happens, it's going to have some positives, some negatives, and but we think it needs to be explored more, and we need to sort of make some decisions.
Lawrence? So thank you for your presentation, very helpful. So you're saying, based on look at the examples you've given in Malta and Spain, that there's an opportunity for New Zealand, let's say a good democracy, an island state.
Yeah.
We've got some smart people here to take an opportunity and catch up or lead some of this technology. Is that really what you're saying, rather than the regulatory side?
Yes, yeah. So that's the key opportunity, and I think sort of building on New Zealand's sort of brand of trust. That's what we've got, and yeah.
And in the international community, in comparison, do we have a lot of leading thinkers in New Zealand in this space, or are we behind?
I think we're generally behind, but what's one key advantage is that actually the Edmund Hillary Fellowship for some years have been issuing these global impact visas and bringing across some of the smartest blockchain folk in the world, and Fred Ursham and folk have been part of some of the reports that we showed. So that is something that we should leverage. So these people have got connections, they've got visas, and they are world leaders in the space, and they're now part of New Zealand. So yeah, I think we can capitalise on that.
So is there any, and last question, is there any significant risk that you could say impartially that the government would need to cover off, as opposed to just encouraging you? So the encouragement side is one thing, and some investment and some help and some regulatory side, that's one thing. But is there anything on the other side that the government needs to sort of more urgently look at, other than tax revenue sharing and how all those pieces of that model go together? It needs to be done sort of quite quickly to allow us to expand.
Yeah, I think with any strategy, and this is what we're calling for, a strategy, there's going to be risks, and as a country we need to decide where we want to sit on that sort of risk profile. And we think it can be done in a controlled way, so the risks are managed, and so there's nothing that really sort of goes bad. So, but we know from the recent sort of headlines that Cryptopia in Christchurch, which put a bit of a black mark on the on New Zealand because they were based here. We have got to be careful, and like any new emerging technology, just like the internet, and we do see this as fundamental as the internet. It's going to be used for bad stuff as well, and we need to be careful to position ourselves in the right place in the country.
Great. Well, thanks, Mark and Bridget, very much for your time this morning. It's been very helpful to us.
Thank you. Great.